Dr. Bedu-Addo, good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much again for hanging out with us here. There's a lot that we want to get into. It's interesting. While we were doing research, it kind of took me back to my biology class and all those other good things. So I saw T cells and I was like, oh man, this is going to be a fun one. But before we get into the nitty gritty of things, if you could please explain it to me like I'm five, what is it that your company does?
Well, our company is a mid to late clinical stage biotech company. Our company develops immunotherapies that train the immune system to specifically target cancer. Right, so we're developing a broad pipeline of targeted immunotherapies based on our Versamune T cell activating platform, and this promotes induction of the right type and right quantity of tumor infiltrating killer T cells. We're also developing a pipeline based on our novel antibody conjugated cytokine IL-12, which is also designed to infiltrate the tumors of patients. So our lead product, which is based on our Versamune technology, is being developed to treat HPV-related cancers like cervical cancer, anal cancer, head and neck, vaginal, vulva cancers. And we currently have 3 phase 2 clinical trials ongoing with PDS 0101. All have generated very encouraging data to date. And we're looking to move this into the phase 3 registrational trial starting later this year. This product has been granted fast track designation by the FDA. And the phase 2 data from our Versatile 002 trial was actually presented at ASCO last month.
Gotcha. I've got some notes here. I want to follow up on that. But actually, let's just do it right now. You mentioned you have 3 phase 2 trials that are currently going on with them starting later this year, phase 3 starting. Is that phase 3 starting for all 3 phase 2 trials or just one of them? Or what are we looking at?
It's for one of those 3 trials. So this would be for our trial in HPV positive head and neck cancer.
Got it. Thank you for that insight. We'll dive into that here in a second. But how are T cells, right? Because we talked about that here briefly. How are they critical in fighting cancer? How do they kind of help along the way?
Well, that's a really good question because I think many companies are developing products that lead to induction of T cells. But what's very important, as you mentioned earlier, is not all T cells are created equal. And so what's important here is to be able to induce the right type of killer T cell. It has to have the right killing potency, and we also have to be able to induce them in the right quantity, right? And that's where our Versamune technology is unique, able to induce the right type, the right potency, and the right quantity. And by being able to do that and allow them to target the tumors, right? So again, I keep on talking about tumor infiltrating, not just not having them in the circulating blood, but actually able to target, infiltrate, and kill the patient's tumors is what's really critical about an effective T cell.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you also have a flu vaccine, right? So how does this technology, whether this one or something else, help with that, the flu vaccine?
So with our flu vaccine, very interesting, what we're developing is what you call a universal flu vaccine. So you may be aware that with flu season, every flu season, we have to develop a new flu vaccine that is supposed to be hopefully effective against a particular strain of flu that will be prevalent that particular year. Very often, the flu vaccine is less than 30 to 50% effective. What we're developing, however, is what we call a universal flu vaccine, which should be effective, hopefully, against multiple strains of the flu. And this will prevent the need to develop a new flu vaccine every year based upon the anticipated prevalent strain of flu that particular year, right? And this particular approach involves both the induction of antibodies, right? So we've heard a lot about neutralizing antibodies with COVID, right? So with this flu vaccine that we're developing, the goal is to be able to induce neutralizing antibodies, but also very importantly, induce T cells, because T cells are the attackers of the immune system. And what happens with these viruses is the regions of the virus that change and mutate are the regions of the viruses that antibodies usually detect and neutralize against. But if you can develop T cells that also attack the conserved areas of the virus that don't mutate, then you have the potential to develop a universal vaccine. And that's the approach we are taking to developing our universal vaccine. And we're doing that in collaboration with the National Institutes of Health.
Yeah, and I'll get to that in a second here, but I also wanted to talk about the data that you recently presented at the ASCO. Give me some high-level highlights here.
Well, we had a pretty active ASCO conference, and this data was specific to our Versatile 002 trial that's evaluating PDS-0101, our HPV-targeted immunotherapy, and Keytruda in patients with HPV-16 positive, recurrent or metastatic head and neck cancer. So the data was actually presented by Dr. Catherine Price at Mayo Clinic, who is co-director of their Comprehensive Cancer Center. And the data was also selected for discussion at the head and neck cancer special session. So we presented data on patient safety, objective responses, patient progression-free survival, and patient overall survival. Now, with objective response, a patient has an objective response if their tumors shrink by 30% or more. We utilized objective response rate specifically as a rapid tool to obtain confirmed statistically improved efficacy of the PDS-0101 Keytruda combination over the historical Keytruda monotherapy data that has been well reported and documented. We have successfully demonstrated that statistical superiority of the combination, or the statistical improvement in clinical efficacy. That's why we're moving to phase 3. Now, moving to the data that the FDA and head and neck cancer oncologists actually care about, safety and overall survival. In those two areas, we also presented some very impressive data. So starting with safety, it's been very well documented that patients who take Keytruda monotherapy, which is the standard of care, have approximately 17% of these patients will have what you call treatment-related severe adverse events. Right, so these would be grade 3, grade 4, and grade 5 toxicities, with increasing grade with severity in the toxicity.
Right.
Now, the patients who took PDS-0101 and the combination, PDS-0101 and Keytruda, we reported that 8%, just 8% of these patients had a severe treatment-related adverse event. Now, that's important also because out of these 8%, all of them were grade 3s. There were no grade 4s and no grade 5 toxicity. So really exciting safety data, very well tolerated to date by these patients. Now, moving on to the most critical data, which is overall survival of these patients. Now, patients who take the checkpoint inhibitors, which are the standard of care, the 12-month overall survival rate for these patients is anywhere from 30 to 50%. Now, to put that in perspective, what that means is that if a patient is diagnosed with recurrent or metastatic head and neck cancer, the probability that they will live 12 months is less than 50%. However, what our data showed here is that if the patients took the combination of PDS-0101 and Keytruda, the probability that they would live 12 months is almost 90%.
Wow.
87.1% to be exact. And this is the power, the potential power of an effective targeted immunotherapy. The goal here is to be able to move this, as I said, into a registrational trial. This is actually what really impressed the head and neck cancer oncologists, and that led the data to be selected for discussion at that session. But some of the comments from that event were novel mechanism of action, impressive safety, impressive overall survival, and the opinion that the data warranted moving into a controlled randomized phase 3 registrational trial, which is exactly what we are planning to do in the fourth quarter of this year. So we are hopeful that this could potentially be the first HPV-targeted immunotherapy for cancer. And we're really anxious to rapidly get this out there to the patients who are really desperately in need of more effective and safe treatments for this really debilitating and devastating cancer.
That 87% plus is definitely an impressive stat. So we've talked about the PDS-0101. We've talked about Keytruda as well. I want to talk about the IL-12. Can you tell us a little bit about that pipeline, and if you have any data available for that?
Yes, we can certainly talk about that. So that product is what we now call PDS-0301. And that, as I mentioned, is an antibody conjugated to the IL-12. And that antibody targets cancer. So the IL-12, rather than staying in the blood circulation, actually infiltrates the patient's tumors. And we've seen really strong synergistic data in combination with our Versamune platform technology. So, for example, with that one of the pipeline products is a triple combination being developed and run by the National Cancer Institute. So they combine PDS-0101 with the IL-12 product PDS-0301 and a checkpoint inhibitor. And one arm of the study they're evaluating is actually in patients who have failed all treatment options, including checkpoint inhibitors. So these are the terminally ill patients. These patients historically have a survival of anywhere from 3 to 8 months, depending on the therapy they take. Right. In this trial, what the National Cancer Institute has reported is that with this combination of our IL-12 and our PDS-0101 checkpoint inhibitor, the median overall survival is 21 months. So here again, you see the power of an effective targeted immunotherapy that can actually induce what we call memory T cells, right? So these are memory killer T cells that survive for a prolonged period of time and actually have that long-term memory and can sustain that anti-tumor effect. So very encouraging data there. We actually announced just 2 days ago on Monday that another study being done with by the National Cancer Institute with this product, combining PDS-0301, the IL-12 product, with chemotherapy, docetaxel specifically, in advanced metastatic prostate cancer, has just been accepted for oral presentation at the Cytokines 2023 conference. And so another pipeline of products that the National Cancer Institute is evaluating, combining that IL-12 product with standard of care, such as chemotherapy, radiation treatment, for example. So we have a lot of optimism about the potential of both our Versamune products as well as our IL-12 based products, and the data to date has been extremely encouraging.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the data that comes out for the phase 3 trial that you mentioned is starting later this year. I mean, it looks like you're attacking a lot of different things. We've talked about the flu vaccine. We've talked about the head and neck cancer, other cancers you're focusing on as well. And then, of course, the IL-12 pipeline, which I believe you said is now PDS-0103. Right. Is that correct? Let me go ahead and kind of turn the tables over to you. 0301. Thank you for the correction there. Let's talk about if there's anything else that I forgot to kind of bring up. We've talked about a lot. We've recapped the past and present and what we can look onto in the future as well. Was there anything else that you want to talk to our viewers about before we head out?
Well, I think we are very optimistic about the next 12 months. We have a number of catalysts coming up over the next 12 months. I'm really led by initiation of our Versatile 003 phase 3 trial, which we anticipate starting in the fourth quarter of this year. We are hopeful that we haven't talked about our Immunoserve trial in cervical cancer. We are hopeful that we'll see some additional data from that trial that's being run by MD Anderson Cancer Center. There's another trial being run by Mayo Clinic in earlier stage oral cancer. We are hopeful that we'll see preliminary data from that trial. And we've also talked about the PDS-0301 pipeline, where we're also expecting potentially exciting data coming out in prostate cancer, for example. And we also have studies ongoing colon cancer. And the triple combination also talked about hopefully some additional survival data from the National Cancer Institute. But we also plan to have the final data from our phase 2 Versatile 002 trial sometime in the second quarter of next year. So quite a busy and exciting year coming up for PDS Biotechnology.
And I look forward to having more conversations as those results come out. Thank you so much. That is Dr. Bedu-Addo, who is the CEO and director of PDS Biotechnology. Ticker on NASDAQ is PDSB. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.